While we're setting up, I want to let everybody know, most folks in the room here know, but for those watching, while this went on the agenda as an item for action at this meeting, it's been decided by the administration that they're not going to request action. So just in the interest of transparency, we'll entertain a motion to postpone it to a date certain, since it's got a bill number assigned and everything else.
So moved. Is it?
At the end of it, yeah, at the end.
Yes, Councilman Flynn, that is correct. We are not requesting action today. This is it's a unique, it's complex, complicated proposal, and
yes,
we wanted to make sure that this body and the community had time to absorb, understand, and ask questions.
Great, that's good. Do you want to go around and have your team introduce themselves?
Yes, absolutely. Evan Dreyer, Deputy Chief of Staff, Mayor's Office.
John McGrath, City Attorney's Office.
Good afternoon. I'm Charlotte Brantley. I'm the President and CEO of Clayton Early Learning.
I'm Jeff Steinberg. I'm Director of Real Estate for the City of Denver.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you. So what we want to cover today is a little bit of history and background, what the current status is, and then go over the terms of the deal, the proposal, and then take questions. Just a little bit of history and background about the property, the 155 acres, which today is known as the Park Hill Golf Course. The city served as the trustee for this property for almost 100 years, from 1899 through 1984. So the city has a long history with this piece of property. In the early 1900s, it was used as a dairy farm. And then in the 1920s, the city decided to optimize the use, change the use to a golf course, which is the use today. In 1997, the city and Clayton agreed to certain use or land restrictions, open space golf course. And then in 2000, those restrictions were folded into an existing an agency agreement, and that agreement exists today. The city and Clayton are still parties to that agreement. And I think we're going to turn it over to Charlotte now, and she's going to kind of walk us through Clayton's current state.
So just very quickly, and again, thank you very much for having me this afternoon. I really appreciate it, Mr. Chairman and members of this committee. Clayton Early Learning is an early childhood serving organization. We've been in business for a very long time. We've been serving vulnerable kids in this community for actually over a century. But in our current form as Clayton Early Learning, we are serving children prenatal to age 5. We reach about 700 children directly across this state. That varies a little bit from year to year based on funding. About 500 to 600 of those children live primarily in the Northeast Denver community. We also employ almost 100 staff, many of whom also live in the Northeast Denver community. Currently, the Clayton 20-year golf lease is going to expire in December of 2018. That was a lease that was entered into originally by American Golf in 1998. We allowed them to transfer it to Eagle Golf, who has now changed their name to Arcus Golf. But that lease will expire at the end of next calendar year. Per that lease, they have to pay us a fixed fee amount of $700,000 a year. And generally speaking, the revenues that they get from the golf operations are not sufficient to cover that full $700,000. So they're usually in the hole by anywhere from sometimes $150,000 to as much as $300,000 in a year. So as trustees of this trust, we began, my board of trustees and my executive team and myself began what I would just refer to as a due diligence process a few years ago, trying to figure out what would we do when this lease expired, knowing that the operator is losing revenue on it by the time they have paid the lease amount to us, that there may be a different future here we would have to look at in order to leverage this asset in its highest and best way to generate the revenue that we need to serve the beneficiaries of Mr. Clayton's trust, who are by and large the children of the Northeast Denver community. So we started thinking about that, as I said, quite some time ago. More recently, as the clock is ticking here, we began to lead a very robust public involvement effort to inform the community about this financial challenge that we were facing, to also share some possible solutions, and to learn community desires. So I want to preface this by saying that Clayton Early Learning, formerly known as the Clayton Foundation, and prior to that it was the Clayton College for Boys, back in the days when the city was actually trustee. That institution and those grounds at Colorado Martin Luther King have been there for more than a century. We have some historic pictures of the campus, and you can tell that the community actually didn't exist yet when that campus was being built. So we have been there as a part of that community for more than a century. We hope to be there for another century, if not longer than that. So it's very, very important to us as we're thinking about how to leverage this asset on behalf of the beneficiaries of the trust to also make sure that at the end of the day, what happens on the future of that land has been informed by the community and what the community would like to see there, particularly those who live close in to that current property. So we began holding some key stakeholder meetings back in November of 2016, nearly a year ago now. We started meeting one-on-one with about 30 different members of the community, just to find out, first of all, what did they know about the land? Did they even know that it was an asset of the Clayton Trust? Many people have believed it was a city asset all these years. And we also want to make sure that they know what we do and who it is we serve in that community now and how that asset generates revenue for us. We also formed a community advisory committee that's got about 25 people on it, and we have met monthly with that advisory committee since February. We plan to continue to do that. We've held 3 community-wide public forums that have been attended by anywhere from, I'd say, about 50 to about 100 people each time. We also hired a company to do a community survey, and they went out and knocked on, it's actually 1,002 doors, just to be really accurate here, 1,002 doors, and we received about 750 responses from this community survey. We also have established a dedicated phone line and a website. People can leave us messages on the website, on the phone line. And we also now have hired some experts to help us document and further lead this community visioning process. We don't believe we're done yet. We've gotten a lot of feedback so far, but we believe there's still some more opportunity to hear from more members of this community.
So let's turn now to the terms of the proposal that will be coming before City Council. City would acquire 50% of the property initially for $10 million. The city would take possession of the property on January 2nd, 2019. That's right after the golf course lease is up. And we would begin constructing the flood protection area for the Platte to Park Hill stormwater system upon taking possession of the property. The city would acquire the other 50% of the property through annual lease-to-own payments of $350,000 a year. There is an early buyout provision, and if the early buyout provision is not exercised, the city would obtain full title at the end of 30 years for $10. That existing agency agreement that I mentioned a little bit ago, and those land use restrictions would be lifted by mutual consent upon execution of this new agreement. The community visioning process that Charlotte referenced is part of the current agreement, and it will continue for the next several months until it is completed. We think by the end of this year, possibly the beginning of next year. This agreement, and these folks will tell you that I've been singularly obsessed with some of these provisions, including one that is that there's a visible and viable path to a no development scenario, that complete open space scenario. The agreement also contemplates on the other end of that spectrum a full development scenario. I would say that based on the community input that we have heard, that Clayton has heard so far, a more likely scenario is a mixture of significant open space and some community serving uses, such as a grocery store, affordable housing has come up a lot, local retail, or some type of local entertainment as well. Depending on the outcome of that visioning process, and this is the if there were to be development, there would then also need to be a master plan and any subsequent rezoning. Those would require separate approval from this body, from City Council as well, open public process. If there are any land sales, Clayton would receive 75% of the proceeds until Clayton received a total of $24 million. After that $24 million threshold, all proceeds would come to the city until the city recoups all its costs, including that $10 million down payment and any annual payments, the $350,000 a year, if any of those payments had been made. Any additional sale proceeds after that would be split evenly, 50-50. The city would control any third-party sales, if there were any, until January 31st, 2022, and Clayton would control then until January 31st, 2039. And after 2039, the city would control and own all of the property. Just a couple final steps in the process, and then we're happy to take questions. Like I said, the visioning process will continue for the rest of this year, several months. We've been trying to, I think, increase the amount of public involvement and community engagement. Again, this is a kind of an intricate, unique, it's a different kind of deal. So we want to make sure that people have plenty of opportunity to ask questions. We held open 3 hours, I think, office hours on September 26th, and we have another one scheduled for later this week. The Park Hill Community Advisory Committee has 2 additional meetings scheduled for October.
And then they'll meet again. Those are just what's scheduled.
Great. So again, we are trying to do as much as we can to try to answer questions and provide information about this deal, including questions that you all may have.
Thank you, Evan. That's a very well-done, compact presentation. Leaves us just slightly under an hour for questions. So I really appreciate that, and the fact that you sent out most of the documents beforehand. Right now I have Council Members Espinosa and Cashman in the queue. Councilman Espinosa.
So actually, I have a question for the city, our city council attorney. I just need some help on some language here in contracts. So on page 2 of this agreement, there's the termination of agent. Article 1 is termination of agency agreement, and what it states there is following the execute. Actually, can you turn to slide 6, because this is what's relevant here. So the first bullet point on here says the city acquires 50% of the property for $10 million and would take possession on January 2nd of 2019. What it says in the Article 1 here is following execution of and delivery of the city's quitclaim deed and termination of the agency agreement, the trust. So if the city is quitclaiming the deed, doesn't that mean we already own the land?
I am not familiar with this agreement at all right now, so I don't want to speak out of turn. Is there a city attorney who has worked on? Oh, John,
Well,
do you want to?
Doesn't a quitclaim imply ownership?
Yes, so the city currently owns fee title to the property.
John, could you lean in closer to the mic? Okay.
Yes.
So
The
step 1 of the
arrangement-
agreement is to turn over land that we own so then we can acquire it for $10 million.
Right, so the city is beneficially and always has been beneficially owned by the trust. In 2000, the city entered into an agency agreement whereby the city took fee title to the property and the trust retained all other incidents of ownership of the property. And so they own beneficial title.
So there is a provision in the 2000 agreement called voluntary termination, whereby the trust could get ownership of the land by simply terminating the agreement with 30 days' notice. Why wouldn't they just, if the trust wants the land, why wouldn't they just exercise that voluntary termination clause?
They have that right.
Okay. Because one of the things here is, as sole consideration of the acquisition of the city's interest, meaning taking that right, says the deed trust simultaneously shall grant a conservation easement to the city. A conservation easement, would that allow development on the property?
Under the terms of the conservation easement, it would be used for open space or golf
Okay,
purposes.
so that's important here in this 2000 agreement, is that all of these terms, the whole, in the background, it says witness that the whole point of this will operate, that the city is, the reason the city is getting this is that the city is agreeing to operate this land, 155 acres, to ensure that the golf course land is preserved as open space. And then the termination is in October 13th of 2099. And then we do have this ability to grant the trust. I mean, the trust can take, can get this asset back, but with preservation of open space. So one of my concerns is and I expressed this in our confidential meeting, which is that the land is currently encumbered with open space B zoning. which is open space. And so these conversations about development are all very, very premature and only are available to the city or anybody if we actually forego in multiple ways the agreements that were codified in this 2000 agreement, which were parlayed from the 97 incident, which were a consequence of a 1984 taxation thing. You know, we have gone above and beyond to sort of marry this, the enterprise that is, I mean, the endeavor that is Clayton and the value of this asset with this desire for the community to have open space. And we have codified that. And this primary mechanism, before any of this other stuff happens, is that we have to first forego all of these agreements to agree to then pay very, very large sums of money that are not current entitlements, but would only become entitlements if we chose to forego and ignore, to replace these existing agreements with the city of Denver and its residents and the constituents and stakeholders, of which Clayton was very much a part of. Is that correct?
Well, there's a lot packaged in there, but yes, it's correct that part of this agreement that we have before you today is an agreement to terminate the agency agreement by mutual consent, which would then have the effect of unwinding the conservation easement. There would still be a lot of hurdles to development, but that is an aspect of this agreement.
Okay, so it's difficult for me, and I just wanted my colleagues to sort of hear that, that the amounts that we're talking about in the totality of this agreement are with entitlements that don't exist unless we electively choose to forego, ignore the fact that there were existing agreements that go until the end of this century. Thanks.
Thank you, Councilman. Councilman Cashman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. What is the magic $24 million number? What is that based on?
So that's Clayton's number. My Board of Trustees determined that in looking at what the potential value of that land might be based on what potentially could go on it, that we were looking at a value that was actually somewhat larger than that, and determined that in order to make sure we were serving community needs as expressed by the community, and I don't know if you've all had a chance to read it, but I did send to you some summary information yesterday about what we're hearing from the community about their desires on this property, that we felt that it was important that in order to ensure that community desires for things such as recreation and park space, in addition to perhaps some of the other things, that we were willing to forego some of the potential income that we could get if it were fully 100% developed. So that's where that number came from.
So you need $24 million.
Yes, it also would generate for us, in the way that we typically manage the funds that are in Mr. Clayton's trust today, what we refer to as our portfolio of funds, that $24 million would be able to generate $1 million a year in spendable revenue. And that's what we believe we need from this asset to continue to sustain the services that we provide to the children in that community.
If I may, but this agreement does not guarantee them $24 million. That there is a risk.
That's right.
Sort of reverse engineering.
I just, as I expressed in our briefing, I can't buy that you need $24 million to be able to fund your mission, which is an outstanding mission, and there's a deal that says you're not going to get that. I just don't buy that. In, I think it was 2000, the possessory interest tax element. So there was some confusion on between in the golf course's mind and maybe Clayton's mind about taxation. So at some point, I believe, is it the city that forgave the possessory interest tax? And what's the deal with that? And
No, so when the city took fee title to the property, the property wasn't subject to property tax. Subsequent to that time, possessory interest tax came about, which was that if there was a private sector entity that ran a business on a city-owned property, that in lieu of that tax, property tax, there was possessory interest tax. So possessory tax was paid by effectively the golf course
Well, we
operator.
split it with them.
Well, right, there's a 50-50 split between Clayton paying 50% of that and the golf course operator paying 50% of it. But there was possessory interest tax that was paid from 2002
We
forward.
still pay it. We still pay it.
Right.
The possessory interest tax, we still pay. We split it with our tenant. And the real estate tax issue, if you cycle back to the fact that the first 85 years, the city was the trustee of the trust, and therefore there was no tax being assessed on that property because the city was managing it as trustee. When the city stepped away as trustee and the 501c3 nonprofit was incorporated in order to become the trustee in the place of the city, that's when this issue arose a few years later of, well, now it was subject to real estate tax, when it hadn't been prior.
And have all those taxes been paid?
Yes.
Well,
Going
I mean,
forward,
Ask-
possessory interest taxes have been paid.
Right, but the
Right.
real estate taxes,
No.
they were not due, because the real estate taxes, either up until the 85 years that Charlotte referred to, there wasn't any.
Right.
And then subsequent to that, possessory interest tax didn't come into play, I think, until 2000 or 2002. It didn't exist within the city until
Right,
that point in time.
but there's a difference between the possessory interest tax and the real estate tax, correct?
Yes.
And so did Clayton, has the city forgiven any taxes to
Do
Clayton?
you want to answer that? Fee with the-
Well, the city as owner under the agency agreement, owner of fee title, makes the property exempt for real estate tax purposes. So to that extent, you could say they forgave, but it was an arrangement that the city agreed to undertake with Clayton as an accommodation for supporting their mission.
And how much is the value of the tax that we forgave?
We'd have to calculate that.
Could you please?
Sure.
I think it's a relevant number.
I don't think at the time there was ever an agreement or obligation that Clayton undertook to repay that. That was,
No, I understand that, but if in fact we forgave tax that they would otherwise be expected to pay, I'd just appreciate that number.
again, I don't think it's fair to say that we're forgiving anything. We entered into an agency agreement which made the property tax exempt for real estate tax purposes.
And what is the value of that agreement that you made?
We can get you a number.
Thank you, I appreciate that a lot. The last question, if I might. Sure. So, a grocery store, which is apparently something that would be nice in that neighborhood. Do we have grocers who are telling us they want to build a grocery store? Or is this just something we're hoping that that's a use, if part of that land gets sold, that would be a use that would be valuable, that the neighbors would like?
Sure. So let me explain just a little bit where that's coming from.
Thank you.
It isn't Clayton saying that. It's not the city saying that right
So
now. It's what we're
neighbors are
hearing from the
wanting a
community.
grocery
So
store.
that neighborhood is an identified food desert. I think both of our council members here could probably attest to that. The access to fresh and healthy food is something that we at Clayton do value quite a bit for the kids we serve. We have about 30 garden beds on our campus that grows fresh and healthy food for our kids and their families all season long. The issue of access to healthy food has come up a number of times in our community conversations. It's been talked about as a grocery store. It's also been talked about as urban farms, as, plots of land that people could come in and grow vegetables on. So it's come up in a variety of ways. We have not had any conversations with King Soopers or Safeway or anyone else at this point in time.
I'm just trying to determine if the talk about a grocery store is a reality of an impending deal,
No.
or if it's simply a wish that a number of our other neighborhoods have for a grocery store that the city's been unable to help broker over the years. So it's, in other words, I'd like to play center field for the Yankees, but there's not a lot of chance of that happening. Maybe there's a chance of a grocery store, maybe not. Okay, is that fair?
But the community is very, very interested, I can tell you
As well
that.
they should be.
Right. Yes, sir.
As well they should be. Great. I have a couple more, but I'll defer.
All right. Councilman New.
Great, thank you, Mr. Chair. Just want to talk about the visioning process for the master plan. Evan, can you go over a little bit more about who will be involved with that visioning process and how long it would take, and will it be facilitated by the city and the Clayton Trust, maybe?
Let's have Charlotte go back over the visioning process today, and then I might ask Steve Nally from CPD to come up and talk about what the city's involvement could be moving forward.
So I appreciate your question. As I mentioned, we started this process almost a year ago. We've been very heavily involved in the community visioning process, I would say, for about the last 8 to 9 months, both in terms of meeting monthly with our advisory committee and then also having some community forums. We have hired R&L as another consultant with us. They are in the mix to not create a land plan at this point. They are there to help us further document what we're hearing from the community in this visioning process and to help us continue to conduct it. We're not done yet. We've heard from quite a few people, but we know that we haven't heard from everyone in that community yet, and we want to give some additional time for other people to be heard about what they might like to see. Our goal at the end of the day in this visioning process is to come up with likely a document that would, will document what we've heard from the community with some level of, in terms of percentages of people who have asked for this or that or the other, or some way of coming up with some kind of consensus-driven, what is it that we're hearing from the community at large? Is everybody going to get everything they ever wanted out of this property? Certainly not. That's not the way life works. But we would like to be able to go on record with saying this is what we have heard from a lot of people within the community.
And then will this vision be really on the 50% that's being leased, or I was assuming that the 50% that they were buying is the P2P retention area, or how's that all
I think
work?
that our vision for the visioning process is that it encompasses the entire piece of property. We do know that there is a need to construct and then utilize some of the acreage for the detention area, but that area can be factored into future vision as well, in addition to the entire property.
Right.
So the retention area P2P won't affect any development along there? You can still do affordable housing or a grocery store or whatever?
Well, I'm not sure what restrictions would exist for development on the actual acreage of the detention area. It probably would be limited to non-improvement, but beyond that.
Okay. I was thinking about the whole 50% the city buys. Is room enough to develop as well as provide the retention, right?
Yeah, it is.
Okay. And last thing, in the contract, it talks about we're trying to reach consensus on the uses, which is a great process, community process, and commend you for that. But in the contract, it says the city does not and cannot make any assurances regarding the outcome of the process. And what does that mean? Does that mean if there's some really crazy ideas that come out through consensus that we need to have the opportunity to?
We can both answer it, I think. We're trying to be as agnostic as possible and to really ensure that there is a process that allows for sincere, genuine, meaningful input, that really the community's vision is heard and can then be incorporated into whatever future use of the property, whatever future use there is. So that's why we're not giving any assurance. We're not saying there will be this, or that there will be that, or there won't be this, or there won't be that.
Okay. So will they get any guidance of this process, or will it just be an open discussion?
Well, I think maybe that's where Steve can help a little bit on terms of guidance and the city's level of involvement as the processes move forward.
Good afternoon, Steve Nally with Community Planning and Development. So if the visioning process that Charlotte has described has an idea or a future vision of development, at that point, CPD will partner with Clayton and we will lead kind of the next chapter or chapters of that visioning process that you would typically see in some of our neighborhood plans or our station area plans, or something that you saw with the National Western Center master plan. We'd essentially write a master plan, continue to engage with the community, continue to work with the CAC or the PCAC, and then ultimately work to a master plan that we bring before City Council for approval, We could go to next level detail and say, actually map some of these uses, map the open space, map where development's appropriate, think about proximity to the station, think about the drainage facility and if there's a way to integrate that into future open space or development. Once we take it through city council adoption, we then have direction for a change of zoning if that's necessary.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr.
Thank
Chairman.
you, Councilman. Councilman Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I wanted to piggyback on a question that was like 4 questions ago about I think Councilman Cashman asked about, what do you need versus what you're guaranteed? What is Clayton guaranteed? And there are lots of different scenarios. What's the worst case scenario for Clayton getting money? Which might not be the worst case scenario for the property, but because by my math, it's 10 million upfront, 10 million through leasing over 30 years, and then we pay you $10 at the end. So it's 20,500,000 and 10?
It's 10 million and then 350,000 a year for 30 years.
Which is the
Again,
10.5
that-
plus the $10. So that is the least,
Plus
there's not an option in there where Clayton makes less than 20,500,000 and $10. Or is there an option that happens by which they make less than that?
There's no option for that.
Okay, so that's the minimum. That's the worst case
And
scenario
that's-
versus the 24 million or 25, okay.
Correct, and that's also the city's maximum required investment.
Got it. So I guess my question is, why was that minimum not set at the amount that you need? And why is there also an opportunity for Clayton to make more without that? I'm trying to grapple with, if we're having an open, honest community engagement, which I believe from everything that I've heard is happening, but are there incentives in this that does make it more profitable for a nonprofit, but more money for your mission if it doesn't end up one way versus the other? And why was that built in instead of just saying, you need $24 million, we want to control this process and have all options on the table, so minimum, maximum, that's what you get? I mean, it would seem that if the community came forward and said, we want, skyscrapers everywhere, right, then Clayton stands to make a lot more money. And if Clayton is driving this community process along with the city, and there's more money on the table, doesn't that jade which option do people driving the bus like? Does that make any sense? Am I rambling?
It does make sense, and I think the answer probably to all of your questions is yes, maybe, and no. Would they make more money if there was development? Yes. But again, I think that when we say we really want a community visioning process, and if there is a master planning process, for those to be rock solid and for the city to be participating and leading those, we mean it. This is an extremely unique opportunity for 155 acres of land. There are not a lot of those around the city. We have an opportunity, I think, to help Clayton continue to serve low-income kids in Denver. We have an opportunity to preserve, if not all of it, a significant amount of open space. And we have an opportunity to lead a process where the community can weigh in a meaningful way, in a real way. And as a Red Sox fan, I would love to see Paul Cashman play center field for the Yankees.
Sorry, you're out of order.
I have an arm. It doesn't work well, but I have an arm.
So I guess I kick one more question to Clayton specifically. So if you need, and you've stated you need $24 million, but under a scenario you could get $20,500,000, what's your consternation? What's your fear in that? Your board has determined we need this, and you might not make that. How much does that affect you, and why did you agree to that?
Well, I guess I would go back to telling you, I would answer that in the same way that I talk to the community about this all the time. That this is, first of all, this is an asset of the Clayton Trust. We are bound as the trustees of that trust in the same way the city was for 85 years. We are now bound to manage that trust in a way that is most beneficial to the beneficiaries, who are the kids of the community. And so we know that that asset has potential to generate more revenue than it does now. We believe that it could. But I'm asking the community to help us balance our need for sustainable revenue from this trust asset, while at the same time meeting the community's desired vision for that piece of land. So I really have been asking I walk around the community, people have heard me say, with a big bucket. Throw all your ideas in here of how we might be able to balance those two things. Clayton's need for funding to serve the kids of that community with what the community desires might be for that piece of land. So we're trying to balance those things. Is there some risk in this for Clayton? There is absolutely some risk in this, but we're willing to take on that risk in light of also wanting to make sure that we are a good and proper member of that community. We've been there, as I said, for more than a century. We'll be there for another century. And so we're serving that community. We are a part of that community, and we would like help in balancing those two goals.
And if I have time for one more?
Quickly.
So maybe you can answer this offline, but my question is, what's the doomsday scenario for Clayton and the community and that land in terms of if this agreement doesn't happen, right? There are so many different options, right? But you could terminate in 30 days. You could continue to try to operate it as a golf course, which is losing money. Like, what happens without this agreement to the people that you serve? The land, at what point does it, you can't maintain it, it sits and does what? Like, what's the picture of what happens without this agreement? And again, I don't know that we have time to get into that right now. That might not be an easy question. Maybe you can, or follow up with me on, I'm trying to suss through all the different triggers in here and figure out what happens if this doesn't happen for this 155 acres and for the people who you serve.
So I'd be happy to come meet with you, and we can write a movie script together.
I actually
I
think
think
it's
we'd
an
all like to
important,
hear.
it's an important
It's a very
question,
important
and I
question.
would ask for indulgence of a minute or two for Charlotte to answer that question.
Yeah, and I think we'd all, if it can't be answered here at the meeting, everybody would like to be copied
An
on
answer to that.
Councilman Lopez, did you want to be in the queue, or did you withdraw?
No, I had the same kind of concern and question as Councilman Cashman did with the grocery store, so I just wanted to reemphasize,
Excellent.
just put a little bit of more weight on the question that you had. And if we did have that conversation, that is definitely a need in that area, and not just with the Park Hill neighborhood, but for that whole region.
Thank you. And unlike Councilman Cashman, you actually played baseball, right?
Yeah, left field pitcher and catcher.
There you go. Oh, you play, okay. Councilman Brooks.
What lifetime was that? Oh, my bad. I didn't mean to go there. Hey, I want to address the grocery store conversation because I've actually been working on it in this neighborhood for the last 7 years, and the issue specific to this neighborhood on Colorado Boulevard is there's no land, there's no place for parking, and so we actually worked to recruit a grocery store right where the Walgreens is, and we just could not get it to work out. The only people that would come was a Walgreens, and they made that a fresh food Walgreens. So if you go in there, there's fresh fruit. But I can tell you right now, there are 2 to 3 grocery stores coming in the area, but on the other side of Northeast Denver, closer to Rhino. This is an area that, for whatever reason now, unfortunately, after all these years, grocers think is very hot. They want to be here. And so obviously there's no LOI signed on any of this stuff, but we know that we can recruit one. Questions for me kind of go on the committee that you guys met with and you revealed this plan. What was the immediate reactions? And I know that I've kind of heard through the community, but I think it's important to kind of voice that.
Sure. I appreciate that question. So we did make it known to them just before we made it known to a larger group of people in the community through a community forum. Various reactions among community members, and we know that we were giving it to them sort of fast and furiously. We had answered the question of why aren't you talking to the city a number of times with our community, we affectionately refer to it as the PCAC, as you heard Steve refer to it as the Citizens Advisory Committee, that we were in conversations with the city, and they were ongoing and productive conversations. We were now to the point where we could tell them what the results of those conversations had been, but it was pretty fast and furious, as I said that night. And so one of the reasons why we're having 2 meetings this month, one on the 12th and one on the 19th, we're having the regular meeting is on the 19th. We scheduled a second one for the 12th, so that any of those committee members who want to come back and talk about it further, hear in more detail, get more questions answered, they can do that.
What was the reaction to the proposal?
I'm telling you, it was somewhat mixed.
Okay.
Based on all of those members.
Meaning that there's individuals who are like, I don't like it.
Well, what I would tell you is that we have some individuals on the committee who are very, very, very interested in open space and parkland.
Yeah.
And
got
other
it.
members of the committee who are very, very, very interested in that and other things, like perhaps a
And just to
grocery
be
store and
very
housing.
clear, everyone on the committee lives, works, or let's just say lives within 1-2 square miles of the.
Probably not, no.
Okay, so this is the point I want to hone in on, because there is something going on in this city where greater, outside voices are stronger than the neighborhood voices, and I really want us to hone in on these neighbors. I've had a number of neighbors reach out to me. I live one neighborhood over from this, who are on the committee, who feel like their voice is being overshadowed. And so I want this committee, as we're considering a lot of things, looking at the contract, looking at all these deals, to hear from the neighborhood. Not traditional folks who've been, but to hear from folks who live there. I just can't stress that enough. Last quick piece. I appreciate you guys getting the terms of the deal in for us. And one of the reasons I was glad that the city was able to work out a deal, because gentrification displacement is happening rapidly in this community, and the only real answer is getting control of land, and so I appreciate you taking that step. My fear in it with the city, and I think maybe this is to Evan, and legal team, and Jeff, you're in real estate, is that and this is, some neighbors have voiced some issues with this, that there's not any teeth in the actual contract to commit us to some of the things that the neighbors say they want to see. Some open space, some affordable housing, and groceries. Those are all values that are huge, right? And you just stated them. But there are not a lot of terms in the deal that really lock us to that. So how do we get that done?
If we're going to go through a true visioning process, how could there be?
I hear you. I understand the tension. The issue is, at the end of the day, we continue to promise to the neighbors that this is the values, this is what we're trying to get to. But if we don't get there, because we haven't reflected any of that in the deal, so that, I guess that's just a comment. That's a concern for me.
Yep, we appreciate that. There are lots of conflicting tensions,
Yep.
needs, and desires here.
Thank you. Councilwoman Kanish.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First question, Steve, probably for you. There's an interesting phrase in the contract on page 3, not a word we usually see. It describes a vision and master plan will help inform subsequent planning relating to the property, which are typically adopted by the city council. Doesn't say must be adopted by the city council. So I want to ask you, is the term master plan anywhere in our code, our city code, that term master plan?
I have to check. It's a good question. I know that so for example, Auraria has a master plan that was not adopted by city council. There are other master plans that other organizations have led that the city has partnered with those organizations, and they have ultimately not been adopted by city council. And so perhaps we were just being a little too general with the language. The visioning process in that document, we're not intending that as adopted by city council, because I don't think it would justify or be considered a supplement to the comp plan. We would want to go all the way through a master planning process. So maybe we split those two terms and we say that a master plan should be adopted or must be adopted by city council.
Yeah, the contract doesn't have that term in it, so
Okay.
anyone from the team, why is the master plan not required? Why do we use this word typically?
Well, maybe I can speak to that. I mean, the code says what it says about master plans and what types go through council process, et cetera.
We just heard that most of them do not. Master plans are almost never adopted by this council.
Okay, I think the reason is it was premature to self-impose a requirement that we weren't sure what type of process we would be going through at the next phase.
That's a concern. So I'm just, question answered, but it's a concern that there is no guarantee that the master plan will be adopted by council. So just noting that. The second question I have, Evan, you mentioned that there's a scenario by which the plan could be all open space, right? You haven't promised that that's likely. We've heard that the feedback so far is that a mix is most likely, but that the contract doesn't preclude. So I guess I'm just curious if the minimum payment from the city, not counting outside parties, but the minimum payment from the city is $20 million. Did you all conduct a financial analysis to demonstrate that that would be a reasonable price for an all open space scenario whereby there are no other buyers and there's no other cash coming into the deal, and that would be a reasonable expenditure?
So we didn't come back and do a analysis of what the land is worth per se, because until there's a visioning process and a subsequent plan and rezoning that would be approved by city council, you can't do an appraised value of the land. However, what we did do was an analysis on what was needed for the detention area and what we would pay out to acquire and perform the aspect of what was needed for detention, and the dollars that we have on the table basically cover that same amount. So what we looked at was, it was a better financial position for the city to be in terms of we can lead a visioning process to see what the ultimate outcome of what should happen to the property, and at the same time have a say in how that process goes forward. If we simply paid the similar amount of money for the detention, what we would have is an easement over however many acres the detention area is, and it's going to be somewhere around 25. We don't know for sure yet because it's a design build. So it was a better option that offered more opportunities for future understanding of how the property would be used.
Evan, are you wanting to correct? Jeff just indicated that $20 million was about what we were prepared to spend on the detention. That was not my understanding, so do you want to correct that?
It's the $10 million for the acquisition of the 80 acres, and then $350,000 a year for the other 80 acres.
Right. So I just want to clarify. When I asked what were we prepared to spend on the detention, I was told $10 million. But I've asked what the zero development scenario is a $20 million cost. So I just want to clarify that that's twice what we were prepared to spend on the detention. And as I understand it, that wasn't land value. That was $1 or $2 million of land value and an additional amount of money for renovation of the golf course and all that, which is very different than saying this land is worth $20 million as open space. So I guess I just want to clarify the numbers here. Did we run an analysis by which we evaluated whether $20 million was a reasonable expenditure if open space was the use and there was no additional money coming back to the city?
No, the short answer is no. But I think that when I talk about this deal being unique and being complicated and complex and different, this is partly where what I'm talking about. There are a lot of different ways to determine value. One of them, the more typical or traditional ways, you go out and you do an appraisal or a financial analysis of that sort. We have a lot of different factors that go into determining value here. What's the value of the detention area? What is the value of open space? What's the value of Clayton being able to continue to serve children at the level that it serves children right now? What's the value of buying time? What's the value of a meaningful community input process? All of those ingredients go into the terms that are in this agreement.
I think I shared some of these questions that are not necessarily answerable in this moment, but I think it's important for us to be able to demonstrate why the value of what the city is paying is reasonable and how it takes into account prior payments the city already made to this entity in terms of the $2 million, and potentially seems like we have some differing facts on the tax forgiveness that's occurred. But to the extent that you can help us with that information, I would appreciate it. Two more questions. One is about the, well, then I'll pick one.
Okay, we have three new questioners in the queue, and then the second round.
I'll just flag that one of my concerns about the agreement is that it contemplates a $350,000 a month payment or a year payment continuing regardless of if and when the land is sold. So if the land is sold in year 2 and it's sold for $100 million, we're still on the hook for $350,000 a year, or?
We wouldn't be in that case because when the $24 million number is reached, the city will have paid off the amount of monies that would be due in total, and then it would go to the split scenario. So in that case, if it was $100 million, in theory, 75 million would go to Clayton, but they wouldn't get that. They would get the money that would take them to the $24 million number. And then at that point, the city would be reimbursed for all the monies that we've paid out. So the 10 million and whatever $350,000 payments we've made. And then at that point, the additional proceeds would be split 50-50.
So this gets into a little bit about how you read it. You use the word reimburse, which is key. We would still pay the money. Your argument is that we would get paid back out of the proceeds. But it's my understanding that we went through this for quite a long time
Yeah,
this morning.
but I think one thing we didn't discuss, which is what Jeff's touching on, is that in a scenario where we're selling portions of the leased property, Clayton would be getting 75% of those proceeds. Once Clayton gets to 24 million, regardless of whether there is any leased property remaining, the city no longer makes lease payments at that point.
So let's, I mean, this is where what scenarios are, I think the challenge of demonstrating to the community that all scenarios are really possible. So what about a scenario whereby 75 or 80% of the land is open space and the development doesn't get to this other amount? Then in theory, the city is paying more for the, open space because the development is bringing in less. So the two sides of it, in some ways, the deal is set up so that the less development that occurs, the more the city is potentially paying per acre for the open space, depending on where the price points are. So just flagging that as a concern that I have. And then I guess my last question is about the urgency and the timing. Why not wait until the visioning process is complete and then go ahead and assess all the costs, or not the costs, but the values, so that we are negotiating with information? Right now, we're negotiating blind. And so, we don't just have the two competing interests that Clayton described. We actually have the third competing interest, which is what is an appropriate use of taxpayer funds, and in terms of, this whole piece, and what's a reasonable cost. And so why not just do the visioning and then have us value, here's this much open space and this much development, and this is what the appraisal is for those prices, and this is a fair price, and we negotiate with information. Why not do that?
So there's two things that come into play. One is that we have a project that we have to get on and start January 1 or January 2nd of 2019. So we've got 14 months from now until then. So that's one. The visioning process, we want to do it over a thoughtful process, as Charlotte described, which is not going to be a quick process. And then in addition to that, regardless as to what that visioning process comes up with, it does not provide for what the approved entitlements would be on the property. And without the improved entitlements, you couldn't go out and get an appraisal, because it would have a high variance as to what was approved for entitlements, if it was high density, if it was medium density, if it was very low density. So until that process was completed, which would entail, in addition to the visioning process, the master planning process, and then coming to city council for approval of a change in zoning, that's when we would actually be able to go out and get an appraisal.
Thank you, Councilwoman. Councilman Herndon.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't have any questions, and I know there are other people in the queue, so I want to be respectful of their time. So I was trying to find this article. I couldn't find it. I read it. I think it was last week. It was a study that talked about affluent families versus lower-income families and their children, and how by age 3 in affluent families, the 3-year-olds are already in early childhood education, and communities, lower-income communities, those 3-year-olds are typically being watched by relatives, and the gap that occurs because 3-year-olds don't have the ability, which is nothing surprising to anybody. So I say that talking about what Clayton does and how vital their mission is to make sure that lower income kids have the same leg up as more affluent kids, because as that study showed, that gap is never closed. And so I start that off by talking about how vital Clayton is and the work that they do, that it's essential that their financial solvency continues no matter who takes over the golf course. I think that that's important to think about. Second of all, I think it's important I would ask my colleagues, if you had 155 acres of an amenity that your community didn't access. Because the golf course is not open space. It's a golf course that you pay a fee to access. So if you're not familiar with Park Hill, it's broken into 3 segments. You got South Park Hill, North Park Hill, and then funny, Northeast Park Hill is the top part. I don't know why Northeast is above North, but that's the way that it is. So I wanted to pull up some statistics about Northeast Park Hill. 25% of Northeast Park Hill families in poverty. And there's another stat, I scrolled down here to the bottom, the environmental health, that dealt with percent, I think I missed it, of children, low-income children with low access to a grocery, and they say low access is more than 1 mile. And the stat was 55%. So 55% of children in Northeast Park Hill have to go more than 1 mile to get access to healthy food. And I don't think it was intentional, Councilman Cashman. A grocery store isn't nice. It's necessary for that community. And what I want is for Northeast Park Hill to have an amenity that they can utilize, because they're not utilizing it right now. My staff, we've been at every PCAC meeting and each community meeting since this happened. And on multiple occasions, people have come up to me and said, hey, is the city interested in this property? Is the city interested in this property? And I know during the bond conversations, there was a conversation about, is the city interested in acquiring? So I'm excited that the city stepped up to the plate, because I do think it's appropriate for taxpayer dollars to invest in a nonprofit that's helping lower income, also communities of color, close that gap that we know that they're suffering with, and possibly create some amenities, because Northeast Park Hill is a food desert, and it's an amenities desert. And the great exercises that they have been doing to see what communities want, you don't have up there at church. And Pastor Del Phillips is part of the PCAC, and so he said church too, so I want to make sure that he talked about that. So hallelujah. I want to make sure that, as Council President Brooks said, the community members that are a part of this have a say. Because Charlotte sent out some data before, I think it was 2/3 of the survey respondents hadn't even utilized the golf course. That's right. So we're not accessing this amenity that is right in our backyard because we can't afford it. When your average median income is around $35,000 to $40,000, you can't afford to golf. You're trying to survive. And so I want us to be sensitive to that community that deserves an amenity that other communities have. So I support this project moving forward, and let's absolutely make sure that the numbers are right. But to imply that it's open space, it's not. It's a golf course. And let's make sure that whatever happens, if there's development, it's what the community wants, the community that is Northeast Park Hill, that has been doing. And thank you, Clayton, because if you have not seen this process that they have been doing, it's been phenomenal to have people sit down and say, what are you interested in a comfortable space? And so I hope when this does come to a time to vote, that our colleagues would move this to the full council. Let's continue to weigh those numbers, but let's also deal with some facts about this is not open space, and it's not something that's serving the Northeast Park Hill community right now. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. I just want to alert Channel 8 and our audience here that we may go over past 3 o'clock, because we're not yet done with our first round of questions, and I got folks up for a second round. So
Can I comment briefly?
I don't know if you can comment briefly.
Yeah, I want to be very clear. I consider Clayton to be always and presently, and I assume in the future, a good and proper member of the community. I absolutely agree that that community needs and deserves a grocery store. I have no problem with that at all. I have a problem with this contract that I think is confusing. My preference would be, if Clayton needs 24 million as their bottom line, that be the number that they're guaranteed in this transaction, and that the city then, after Clayton as well, that the city continues with the community process as owner of the property, and figure out. I mean, I'm a parks advocate, but I also recognize that's a lot of acreage and there's other needs in that community. My problem is that to have Clayton saying, their board of directors saying, we need $24 million, and to have this contract that says, well, part of the possibilities are they're not going to get it. And I don't think that it's ethically proper for us as a city to put Clayton in that position, or the community in that position. I don't want any confusion that I'm trying to shortchange the neighborhood or Clayton. I find, and everyone I've talked to finds this contract confusing. And, yeah, I don't think there should be a way that Clayton gets less than what they need in this. Thank you for the courtesy, Mr.
Thank you.
Chair.
I think you just grabbed it, but that's fine.
Well, sometimes a guy got to do what a guy got to do.
It's that baseball arm of yours.
It is.
I had a couple questions before we start a second round, and I want to piggyback on Councilman Cashman's observation, and that is, you're not really getting $24 million, even, you're not even getting $20.5 million, because the present value of those $350,000 annual payments, if nothing else happened, you wouldn't get the last payment till 2049. And so have you figured what is how are you annuitizing it, or how are you capturing the full value? Because in 30 years from now, those $350,000 annual payments are going to be about the same as my monthly mortgage. How do you factor that?
So to maybe speak to what both of you have just raised, and again, as I said before, we understand that we are taking some risk with the way this is written. We have also had some preliminary conversations with some potential third parties, such as the Trust for Public Land. Other entities that may be interested in becoming a part of this as well, that would like to not only see open space, but they would like to also see, if there is development, that there is true usable open space intertwined, within it, that sort of thing, not just a sidewalk with a little strip of grass along the edge. So I think there are other potential ways that we could get to that 24 as well.
So you think, do you have a plan right now to capture that $10.5 million that you're getting over 30 years, to capture that value today or not? It doesn't sound like you do.
I'm not sure I understand what you mean, to actually capture
Our
it in
lease
cash,
payments,
to get
our
it in
lease
cash?
payments over 30 years
Not to get it in
are not
cash.
worth $10.5 million.
Right,
They're
worth
worth whatever you could have gotten by 2049 for that, with that last payment.
Right,
Okay, so that leaves you far short.
that's part of the risk. We do understand that.
Okay. Could you identify for us, not here, but maybe by email, what other land and what other assets does the trust control around Denver?
The only thing that we control now is the 20-acre historic campus at Colorado and Martin Luther King.
Okay.
We did have a small piece of parking lot across the street, across 35th Street from the golf course clubhouse. We sold that off a couple of years, maybe 3 or 4 years ago. Some of it was owned by the city, some of it was owned by us. It got sold off in a parcel.
So
There were other real estate assets upon Mr. Clayton's death. Many of those were sold off by the city when the city was trustee.
When the city was basically ripping off the trust for decades, right? I'm going to be the only voice at this table who will probably say that, and again, historically speaking, the city's has a very sordid history with the trust and mismanaging it and ripping it off, and self-dealing when it was the trustee, and that's why I think the Attorney General took us to court back in the early '80s, and we were displaced as a trustee. And so I'm sitting here thinking you probably ought to get more money to make you whole, other than the $2 million that we already paid you. How are you accounting for the $2 million conservation easement? How do we balance that out on the ledger in this
Well, I
transaction?
would tell you that on Clayton's side of that deal, in terms of, again, coming up with the 24 as the minimum, we felt like we could go into this deal. And yes, you're correct, we may or may not get that 24, but we took that 2 million into account
Okay,
in looking at the 24.
okay,
Basically foregone potential income.
okay. And maybe Evan or Mr. McGrath for you, I have a problem with using the Platte to Park Hill wastewater enterprise funding for $10 million to buy 80 acres when only 20 acres is needed for the project. That sounds like diversion to me. How is that? How do you justify that?
Well, the funding for the $10 million purchase price is coming from CDOT under the IGA that the city has with CDOT. So those funds on day one will not be wastewater funds.
They won't be.
Right, but we will do an accounting along the way here. You know, we've got potential for dollars going out, potential for dollars going in. BMO's very carefully analyzing exactly what is a justifiable and proper charge to the enterprise fund and what obligations need to be allocated elsewhere.
Okay, and CDOT is giving us 40-some million total under that agreement?
Yeah, I think it's more in the neighborhood of 60.
60-some?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Let me go into the second. Can you all stay for a few minutes?
As long
By
as
a
you
few
want.
minutes, I mean probably half hour. Councilman Cashman, did you have other questions? I had you.
No, thank
Okay.
you. I already
Councilman New.
grabbed my second time.
On the, just on the 2015 appraisal that y'all did, you know, that listed as-is valuation of about 24.4 million, and, you know, a rezoned appraisal of about 27 million. Did that factor into your decision about the 24 million? How did you use that information?
So just in transparency here, we did that appraisal. We also have done a second appraisal since that time. And in doing that, you know, what we were needing to do as, again, trustees of this trust and therefore stewards of this asset, we had to come up with some way to figure out what was its potential value going to be, going from 0 to, you know, whatever it might be. And so that was our purpose behind getting some assessment data in that was based on just some truly ballpark. What if it was all park? What if it was fully developed? What if it was somewhere in between? This was before we had gone to the community at all, because we had to have some understanding going into the community visioning process as well of what is it we're trying to balance here in terms of stewarding this asset on behalf of the children, while at the same time hearing the community. So the 24 million was backing down from what a potential value of that land might be, taking into account the 2 million, and also taking into account that wanting to meet community needs, we probably wouldn't get every dollar that a more perhaps typical landowner might be out there to get.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Sure. Councilman Espinosa.
Yes. So some of this discussion is concerning, because if there's a visioning process, if it follows any of our sort of normal protocols or standards, it wouldn't be binding, you know, and we've deviated a lot. So I wouldn't put a ton of faith in any visioning process that isn't codified in some manner that is binding, and there's no talk about that. Charlotte had mentioned an appraisal 2 years ago. Is this that appraisal?
That's correct. And we I'm not sure how that got released, but yes, that's it.
Okay. Jeff, did you, I mean, it's actually available on the website. So it's there, and what it does is it very clearly shows the value. The only way you reach the sort of land values that we're talking about is clearly stated here, is without, I mean, it says that the golf course restriction, essentially the open space restrictions have to be removed. So again, it's not, and that's what we're doing. So I just want to sort of comment here that this concern about this being, you know, your constituents having open space access, that these changes to remove this open space encumbrances that are currently on this land in order to unlock value and willfully choose to use taxpayer money to then pay for it may be a good cure for sort of historic ills that have been on the Clayton Trust, but you know, we should state it as charity in that regard rather than sort of you know, blur it into this real estate deal. The fact of the matter is if we release it to development, suddenly that land is not open space and it's not accessible to everybody. There'll be a cost of entrance into any new development that occurs there. You know, whereas it could go to an open space conservancy and get free and public access, and we could enter into an agreement whereby we pay the Clayton for maintenance of it or some sort of other way for a long period of time, which would allow free and public access to this open space, because that was what was memorialized historically in prior documents in the agency agreement. You know, the city owns a full block. Half of it is vacant at 38th and Holly. If we really were vested in grocery and solving a food desert, I mean, the Safeway distribution is right there at Colorado and I-70. I mean, let's use $10 million to address the food desert on land that we already own. You know, because there are a lot of concerns here, but it all, to me, again, centers around, we're having a conversation about land that already has entitlements and encumbrances that we already own fee simple. And we would then, you know, so I think go back to where my original thing is, you know, this whole conversation is about putting on obligations that are currently not there and having a conversation about development opportunities that currently don't exist. You know, unless some prior council and some prior city just completely got it wrong about preserving open space, we need to think twice about how this land became encumbered before we start talking about releasing it to some sort of development potential and then essentially overpaying. I mean, paying market value for land that doesn't have that value today. So,
Thank you, Councilman. I have Councilman Clark and Cashman back in the queue, and if anybody else wants to get in, please let me know, but otherwise let's look toward wrapping it up. Councilman Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to respond a little bit to what both Councilwoman Kinich and Councilman Espinoza just brought up, and it's just for a second to look at it from a different angle. And I think TPL, you had mentioned them maybe being involved. I think they have done some real research on this, but I do think that we should not say that that open space is the lowest land value, and you have to unlock the value of this land, you have to somehow have development rights. You know, the true value of open space is much more than what we would be paying for it to preserve it as open space, which is why I get back to the question I had, which is what happens if we don't do this agreement? What are the scenarios under which this happens? Because unlocking development rights is one thing, but preserving open space may not show up in an appraisal as a high value because you don't have zoning to build 10 stories. And yet, for me, it is a near priceless value on land to have open space. And so, you know, that's, again, I'll just follow up and say, I would really love, and I know you asked for a minute of indulgence and then didn't get it, and so I don't know if we have that minute now, but you know, what happens to the potential of preserving open space if we don't step in and pay for a value that doesn't show up on a balance sheet for a real estate agent and private development, just because there aren't a lot of people who'd go out and privately purchase a piece of land to then use solely for community use, but is of more value than anything else in a city that is growing as quickly as it is and has limited resources, especially taking an amenity that is not open. And that we had the same discussion earlier in my district about people saying, well, you know what I see with that open space is I see a no trespassing sign every day, right? And really taking that and having the ability to open the gates and make open space, creation of open space in a city with limited land value. So again, I don't know if we have time for it, but that I think that's an important part of the discussion is the value in that. And not to minimize the value because it doesn't show up on a ledger sheet of open space.
Anyone want to respond to that?
Yes.
Go ahead.
I also wanted, I think Charlotte should respond to kind of the doomsday scenario of,
Right.
of what could happen. But, you know, Councilman Espinoza, I think, talked about, or very briefly made mention of whether or not a prior city council got anything wrong. And we're not implying that anybody got anything wrong. Circumstances, needs, those things change and evolve over time. And that agreement contemplated potential changes as well. And you know, here we are in the year 2017. There's a lease agreement that expires. The city has very real needs for detention area. So those are newer circumstances and newer needs. And that's part of where we are.
Charlotte?
Well, and to build on that, if you cycle all the way back to the 1920s, it was being turned by the city from agricultural land, which wasn't the highest and best use, into golf to create revenue for the kids. And so I think sometimes I think about it as here we are 100 years later with the opportunity to perhaps rethink that once more. 20 years ago, I think the community was heard again, and open space was what they really wanted to see happen on that land. That isn't what we're hearing by and large from the community at this point in time. There are certainly some people in the community who would like to see it remain 100% open space. There are other people who clearly value recreational space, parkland, true parkland, where you can walk your dog and send your kids to play, which is not what it is now. But they want that in addition to something else. They would like to see it maybe 50% or 40% or 70% open space and something else. So that's why we continue to move through this process with the community. I want to be very clear about that. We're really trying to zero in on what is that community value, and they are not, by and large, using it as the amenity it is today. It gives us $700,000 a year in income. January of 19, we lose that. It goes away. $700,000 a year goes away out of our budget. It's a pretty significant part of our budget. So that's one piece of maybe that's chapter 1 of the movie script that we can write together. You know, if it were to remain golf, it's got declining revenues. It has declining rounds being played every year. There's no way we would get $700,000 a year ever again, probably, off that piece of land. You know, where does it go from here? I'm not sure we can quite say, except that if we can't leverage this asset in the way that we should as stewards of the assets of this trust on behalf of the beneficiaries of the trust, the kids are the ones who lose at the end of the day. The children that are the beneficiaries of this trust are who will lose out if we can't figure out the right way to leverage this asset on behalf of those beneficiaries of the trust and figure out how do we provide benefits to the larger community.
Thank you. Councilman Cashman.
Yeah, quick question. Is there any scenario, I guess this for Evan, I hate talking to Red Sox fans.
Brought up the Yankees, Councilman.
Yeah, I hear you, brother. Is there any scenario where we're thinking about using the course for golf in the short term, or does the need for the detention area prohibit even a 9-hole course there?
I think we are evaluating whether or not timing, the need for how many acres for construction would allow for some possibility of probably not 18 holes, but maybe, you know, back 9, maybe driving range, maybe clubhouse.
Okay.
So, yes.
So it's on the drawing board. Okay. And yeah, I would just reiterate, my choice is not to hold Clayton's feet to the fire. I'd rather we take ownership of the property, let them focus on their mission of education, and then we determine what the use of the property is going to be. So, thank you, Mr.
Yes. Councilwoman Kniech.
Yeah, just I guess a real quick comment, because you know our job is to scrutinize these things, and we don't get to sit at the table where they're negotiated, which is always a tough position to be in. I too, like Councilman Herndon, heard from a lot of people who asked about the city stepping in and the city taking over and the city buying it, and so I just want to make clear that I do think we're in the right direction of having the city involved, right? I think that knowing that, you know, this is not just up to a discussion about private marketplaces, aside from the fact that legally we were always going to be, you know, having some leverage given an easement or the agency agreement. But even just aside from that, I think I think this is a good thing that we're having the discussion. I think the challenge just becomes the very particular mechanisms that were chosen in this contract, right? And so to Councilman Herndon's, you know, point about, you know, the really important interests of making, you know, space available to the immediate residents and all of those things, I think it's just sometimes concern about, does the agreement pave the best way to doing that? Was there a different term or a different way that might have better achieved that protection? That's what I'm struggling with, but I definitively believe that it's the right thing that the city's at the table with skin in the game. So to me, at least, those fundamentals are in the right direction. I'm going to keep grappling with the details, and just wanted to just clarify, since that's not always evident when you're just asking questions.
Good. Thank you. Council President Brooks.
Thank you for the introduction. Just a quick comment. I want to double up on what I said before about really listening to residents within the distance of the Park Hill Golf Course. So would you please tell us when the next meeting is going to be so that folks can attend who are really interested in this? Folks can attend and listen to, or is this closed to the public?
Well, so we haven't set a date for the next community forum, right? Yeah, so I was going to go there. Thank you. We have another set of office hours this Thursday afternoon on the Clayton campus from 4 to 7. I'll be there. I think Evan will be there. John may be there. So we're there for anyone to come by and talk to us. So that's number one. Number two, the Community Advisory Committee meetings, we have never closed them as if they couldn't be open to the public. We do have a selected group of people who are on that committee.
That's right.
Much like this
So-
body in a way. And
Yeah.
so, but anyone, we wouldn't bar the door if someone wanted to come to that meeting. We will have future community-wide forums as well. We're going to be meeting with R&L. Our team here is going to be meeting with R&L later this week to figure out now from here through December, January, what are the steps we need to now go through?
Great.
And what are the times at which we will have broad community input?
I think these dates are the ones I really just wanted to highlight and just let folks know, if, who have concerns, they want to hear from the community. This is an excellent way to enter in. And I know Councilman Herndon's been attending those, so just putting that out there. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councilman Brooks. I think because this item appeared initially as on the agenda as an action item, I'd like to entertain a motion to postpone it to a date certain, and I want to suggest October 31st, November 7th.
We really, truly don't have a date
Okay.
at this time to offer.
Okay, well, let's, I'll move that we postpone it to November, well, let me entertain a motion that we postpone it to November 7th, and if the administration's not ready to proceed, we'll deal with it then. I just feel like because it's filed under a number that we have to deal with it, and we can't just leave it setting on the agenda.
Mr. Chairman?
So,
I
yeah.
think we would respectfully request no specific date. We haven't matched up our own calendars, and I would hate for you have to entertain another motion.
I would happily do it, because our council rules don't give us any option other than a date certain, but not an uncertain date.
You don't have to take any action. Mr. Chair, you don't have to take action.
We don't?
You don't. You don't.
Okay.
You have to count the presents right here.
But way to cross your
The days of
cross your
David
Ts
Broadwell
and-
are gone.
or dot your
I
Is.
think if David were sitting here, he'd tell us we had to do that.
You know, you have to
Evan, I really appreciate your team and all the time that you put into this. And my final closing observation is I sure wish we had this kind of effort on the open space at Loretto Heights campus, but that's not possible anymore. No other business. We'll stand adjourned. Thank you very much.